Hello my dear friends. That video I have decided to dedicate to talk about observables and promises. To talk about them, to analyze, to see what's the difference between them and to see what's the similar. And as usual, that video will contain three main parts. The first one part is introductional part where I'm gonna to explain the history of that video, why I have decided. Also, to whom that video can be addressed, maybe anything else. The next it's the main part where I'm gonna talk about the observables and promises with you to analyze, and the last one it's the summary, the conclusion, like for every video. So a bit about the history of that video. I think the main reason it's many years ago on some interview. A person asked me that question, what's the difference between observable and promises? And the question for me was strange. Yes, I provided an answer, etc., but then I was thinking, does it make sense in general, that question? Because the feelings which I had was like, what's the difference between TV and mobile phone? Yeah, looks like if you will compare feature by feature, it's the same, but it looks like it's different because it's different devices and different purpose of those devices, etc. So, and the same I thought about the promises and observables, but eventually in some time I reached a point of view that it makes sense to ask that question because it's very powerful question. It's common question from which you can retrieve many other questions. You can deep dive with an engineer and into details of the promises, how he or she has been applied in practice to get more his experience, to understand his experience and his knowledge, how it's deeper and comprehensive, the same as for observables. And I think that's the main reason why I still sometimes may ask on interview that question. And I've decided to create that video just maybe to first of all to discuss with you. Maybe you can say one more difference which I missed and something interesting. Also, maybe someone of you will find something new for you personally. And I think that video obviously can be addressed to the technical guys. So I assume you have experience of working with the promises and observables, but we'll happy if you will find and if you are not an engineer, but you still can find anything. So that's an introductional stage, and I think we have finished it. Let's go to the next one, which is like the comparison. How are I gonna to do that analysis and that discussion? I think I will go through the bullets 1, 2, 3, etc. like different traits for consideration of observables and promises. What's the difference? The first one, I think it's the implementation. So the promises, they implemented natively. I think it's very important. Is it better or not? I don't know exactly, but anyway, the one argument why it's better I have. Everything that's natively supported, it's more stable. That means that promises established by the standard, it's agreed the implementation with the browser, with the browsers, producers, etc. And to make any changes really too complicated, because they should be like considered and discussed on some levels, because the community is like more wider and the process of improvements is more complicated, and that makes less risky that any essential changes could happen there. It's not the same for the observables, because the observables, they are maintained by a RxJS community, a RxJS library, and everything what's supported or maintained or created inside by such community, for me it's always risky, because at one point of time the huge or essential changes may happen. Let's remind the situation with AngularJS and Angular. Yeah, it was a disaster because at one point of time, I mean, yes, we had a couple of years to migrate from old project from old version to new generation. But in terms of programming in our life, it was one point of time, and the changes was really like essential. It's not like an update. It's the new version. It's the new framework, and but because it's community and they have rights to do such changes, and it's less easy than to change, for example, how promises will work. Also, the one more kind of, I don't know, benefit or something like that, sometimes what's natively implemented can work faster. Is it the case for the current comparison? I'm not sure, and that's why I'm not gonna to talk about that, because it's really complicated to compare what will work faster, because because to create an observable which will work, which will repeat the behavior like a promise, it's also a tricky case. That's why having such implementation, I could compare, but I don't want to talk because I don't think there are many other differences which makes clear what the observable is and what the promise is. So that was the first bullet, which is like implementation. The next bullet, what we can talk about and compare somehow them, it's, I think, the constructor. Both of them, promise as well as observables, they are constructors. That means, and one comment there I forgot to mention, it's, I'm considering, for the sake of that video, the simplest form of observable and the simplest form of promise. So that means observable constructor without any operator, without even pipe method, just only observable and subscribe method of it. And the same for promises, the simplest form of promises, which is like new promise, etc. So as I said, both observables and promises, they are constructors. So that means they can be invoked and created an instance from them with a new expression. Both of them receives the callback function as a constructor argument. Those callback functions receives the arguments, but slightly different. For example, the promise callback function assumed to receive two arguments, the resolve and the reject callback functions, which you can use to change the state of the promise instance, to make it resolve positively or reject it negatively. Observables at the same time, as I said, constructor consumes a callback function which expected to receive the observer argument. It's like, by the way, sometimes you can hear subscribe. Personally, I don't know how it's better, and that's why I apply the same term, equal, either observer or subscribe, but doesn't matter. Observer, it's an object which has three main methods. The first one it's next, the second it's error, the last one it's complete. So that's also can be used to change the state of the observable instance which you have created, positively resolve, negatively, or to continue its life. So as you can see, they are like similar, but there is some small difference between arguments. Also, there is one more interesting difference between those callback functions, but I think I will put it at the end. I will talk it at the end of that video. The next one, bullet, it was the second. The third one, bullet, it's chaining. So I think the purpose of the promises and observables, both of them created to manage the asynchronous code. That's the similar, but promises I think less powerful than observables. So for example, you can use in pure JavaScript add event listener, set timeout, maybe fetch, maybe anything like that to create asynchronous code. And promises, it's not the same to set timeout, for example. It's not similar, it's a new instrument. For me, promises, it's a new instrument which helps you to manage asynchronous code and make it chainable using then operator. And in fact, at the end, it will look like your code is written in a synchronous way. Observables provides the same opportunities, so you can manage also asynchronous code as well as synchronous code, and you can manage it asynchronously and synchronously, so it's more powerful. Depends on the implementation. And observables, they are using not then, they are using pipe operator, which assumed to get the list of operators. And at the end, that looks the same or similar to observables. You can see the chain of the code which will be executed like it's written in synchronous way, but it's possibly can have asynchronous invocation. So the chaining, it's what those entities have and what's similar, I think, to them. The next it's execution. The next fourth bullet is execution order. It's a bit complicated to explain, but it's different, and here is the completely different between those two entities. Let me try to explain that bullet. Promises. When you write a code like new promise and you put the callback inside, and even if that callback is immediately resolving the promise, for example, it contains a callback function for promise constructor contains just only resolve invocation, that means it's immediately resolved promise. And even if you will do then, the execution will be different. Interpreter, once it reaches the code new promise, it invokes the promise callback which you put inside the constructor, and it invokes the resolve function which you put as a one-line code. The next row, it will be like I said, the promise.then, and you pass the callback inside. And here is like take into account that you already have resolved your promise and you expect that callback will be invoked. It will not be invoked. The interpreter will go to the next row. It just only schedule that callback to be executed as a part of microtask queue. That means that just only when interpreter will have finished execution of all the rest lines of the code and will find the finish, it will start looking not into the event loop, but it will take the first microtask from the microtask queue and will execute. So that means even immediately resolved observable doesn't trigger immediately invoked callback inside then method. It's a good approach because you can use it when you want to postpone the execution of some part of your code at the end, when everything is finished, and like a conclusion for your invocation to execute something. And what's interesting, you cannot change that behavior. You cannot change. It will work like that without any exception. With observables, it's different. When interpreter executes the first line of your code like new observable and consumes the callback, the new instance of observable will be created, and the callback function which you put inside the constructor will not be invoked. It will be assigned to that object just only. When the next row will be your instance of observable.subscribe and with some callback, interpreter at that point of time will invoke the callback function, and if you have, for example, depends on how you have written the code inside, will be the result of invocation the subscriber callback. Is it immediately or is it postponed? For example, if the function which you put inside the constructor of the observable contains just only observer.complete or observer.next, doesn't matter. Even when the interpreter at the second row of code and the second line of code where you're subscribing, so at that point of time, the callback function will be invoked, immediately resolved with a complete or, for example, next. Then the subscriber callback will be invoked, and then interpreter will go to the next line. So it's completely different to promises. You can write the code for observables which will in fact work like synchronous code. But if you have an asynchronous implementation in your callback function, that will work asynchronously and similar to promises. So that's like execution order is very important, because without that knowledge you may miss some bugs. And I think that's it, what's related to execution order, but there are many other things which to talk about it. The next bullet, I think it's life cycle. Life cycle, it's like my term which I used to talk about one time or many times, because sometimes people I heard say that promises it's one time entity, but observables it's many times, and that's why I've decided to apply here the term life cycle. And for promises, it's not obvious that it's just only one time. It's not fully one time. Let's discuss and consider the case. You have a promise, and yes, you have a variable which is pointed to the instance of the promise which you have created. You resolved that promise, and yes, you can either resolve or reject, and just only one time. You cannot do it many times. You have one promise, and you have eventually the final state, is it resolved or reject. But you can still reuse that instance in other your places of code, and then continue chaining from that existed and resolved or rejected promise still with the then operator and put your callback. For example, if you have a service which contains the instance of the promise which sends the request to the backend and gets the user data and resolved the promise with some data, then a lot of consumers in the rest places of your application can subscribe with them and gets its value. You cannot already change that value, but you can still reuse it. So it's similar to what we have with observables replace subject, but replace subject can, when you subscribe to it, can give you the last value, one or many, doesn't matter. For example, just only the last value. But with replace subject you can change that value then. With the promises you cannot. So that's why I say that it's one time, but not fully, not exactly. Observables from another side, as I said before, has three states. The complete state, which ends its life with a successful kind of result, error, and next continue the life of observable. So but here is very interesting issue. Here is very interesting, and the next bullet, it's the conception, and I'm gonna to say the last what I think the important, the conception. It's the last, maybe not last, but okay, bullet, one more bullet. The conception is different. When you create, because before I was talking about the life cycle, but now about the conception. When you create an observable with a new constructor, with a new expression, you don't create like a promise instance. You're creating an instance which has inside assigned a callback function, and kind of creation of when you do subscribe, just only at that point of time you are creating the subscription. So observable by itself, it's a factory. I like relate to observables like to factories. For me it's like factory. Promise, it's independent, isolated class which you can create an instance from it with a new expression, can change the state, resolve, reject, but with observable it's not. When you create new observable, you have created just only the factory. And then you can use that factory with the subscribe method to produce always how many times you will do subscribe, so many times you will create a new subscription. The subscription is by itself the conjunction of the callback invocation and your callback. And again for every time you will do subscribe, the callback will be invoked, and its particular callback method which you put inside the subscribe will be binded. So many times will be invoked the constructor function, and so many times will be invoked the callback. So how many times you did subscribe. So looks like it's also like a controversial with an opinion that is it one time, is it many times? I don't know, because every subscription is one-time conjunction. You cannot subscribe to the same one invocation of your callback function many times, like with the promises. In the promises you also just only one time invokes your callback function, and you can subscribe many times to the result of it. The same with observable, no, not the same but similar, because if you have one subscription, it's just only one invocation has happened, one request has been sent, and one callback is binded, and even you cannot to put one more callback to the same result. If you will do the subscribe, it's the new request if it's supposed that the observable inside the constructor sends the request. That means that the new request will be sent, and new callback will be scheduled for that response. So it's difficult to explain, is it one time or is it many times? And the conception is mostly like observables, it's a factories. About the invocation. As I said, your callbacks will be invoked many times, and yes, there are many operators which can simplify, which can merge, etc. There are many other forms of observables, like replay behavior, like subjects, etc. But in general, as I said at the start of that video, in general, I'm considering the simplest form. And even that subscription, which is created by the subscribe, it's also like one time, but many times can be of that construction can be considered just because you can use the next, and your callback can be invoked many times, but just only one callback. If you want to subscribe with a different callback, yeah, it will be the new invocation. So also a couple of last bullets, I think that's related to that comparison. It's, I think, unsubscribe. It's often I can hear as an answer on that question that you can unsubscribe from observable and unsubscribe, but you cannot unsubscribe from the promises. Yes, it's true, you cannot, because promise by itself, when it's created, the constructor function is already executed, and every consumer can subscribe to it using them. With observables, it's not like it's not the same. You can, as I said, observable is a factories, the conception of factories, and when you have subscription, you can unsubscribe from that subscription. And the last one bullet, it's return function. I've decided to talk about it at the end of the video because considering the constructor, if you remember, the first bullet of comparison in my video was compare constructors, of observable and promises, and I said that there is only slightly difference between of them. It's a list of arguments which consume the promise and which consume the observable, and but not just only this is the difference in constructor function. The promise constructor function is not supposed to return anything. It returns void. But the observable constructor receives a function, and it expects that that function can return the callback function. That callback function is invoked when you do unsubscribe from subscription. And it's, not so many people, like I found, knows about that. That observable constructor function returns something, but it's important because, for example, let's say you want to create your own implementation of interval observable. How you will shoot down that interval? Because in any case, the implementation will be at some point of time to do inside the constructor function invocation set interval and schedule that interval. But how to cancel that interval when when you are unsubscribing from that subscription? Because if it's just simply unsubscribe and that's it, without shooting down that set interval, it's memory leak, it will continue it's working. That's why returning the callback function from the constructor function, it helps you to apply the closure. And when you are unsubscribing, that callback function is invoked and you can shoot down your set interval. So that's very important. I think that's it, what I wanted to tell you about the observables and promises. What's last, I think maybe some conclusion. So I don't know whether you understand or not, but for me it's a different conception, promises and observable. Observable, it's more powerful conception. It's conception of factories when you produce subscription. You can create many different forms of it. You can create many different interesting chains, how to combine and manage a synchronous code. So it's like a very powerful tool. Promises, a universal instrument of exact behavior, of exact goal. But still you can use them pretty easily and combine with wait async, and it makes the asynchronous code more readable, and sometimes even more readable compared to the code which is written with observables, because it's not so easy for everyone to understand how does it work under the hood. And what I usually use, it depends. I like promises as well as observables, but observables mostly I use in front-end applications. When it comes to backend implementation, I may use both of those implementations. When I see that here is the sense of some event channel, of event pipe to be created, I will use RxJS and observable. And but if I see that it's simple service which just only sends the request, it's possibly to provide the returning of the promise, and then if you will want, you can convert it to observable as you wish. So that's it. I don't know whether you have been interested in watching my video or not, but I hope you found something new, and maybe I missed something, and you can put in the comments. I will read and maybe discuss it separately if it will be interesting. That's it. Bye.